Just want to say good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Power of Archives, Finding the Home Children Who Went to Canada. This session builds on our Tuesday evening webinar, which was Give Us the Power to Make a Golden Bridge Across the Atlantic, honouring the story of Glasgow's child migrants. My name is Audrey Wilson. I'm the Partnership and Engagement Manager at the Scottish Council and Archives, and I will be your chair for today's session. On behalf of everyone involved, I'd like to extend a warm welcome and a huge thank you to you all for joining us. So before we begin, a very quick housekeeping note. We have enabled closed captioning for this session, which is only by default. If you prefer not to use captions, you can switch them off by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar will be recorded, and if you'd rather not appear on camera, feel free to turn your camera off. While the text in the chat will not be recorded, links to resources will be sent to you afterwards. So I want you to sit back and relax and enjoy the presentations without worrying about taking notes. So a little bit of a brief introduction to today. I was first contacted by Ingrid Shearer of Glasgow Building Preservation Trust, who had discovered a digital archive called the Golden Bridge Project, and she wanted to include it in the Glasgow Doors Open Day Festival, which this year focuses on the theme of diversity and diaspora. And when Ingrid shared the link, I was surprised and shocked to learn about the large numbers of children from Glasgow and the UK who were sent, often unsupervised and vulnerable, to the other side of the world. Tuesday's webinar revisited Tuesday's webinar revisited the Golden Bridge Project, a digital exhibition sharing the stories of child migrants from quarriers' homes. Today's webinar builds on that conversation by exploring the history of British home children and how archives have helped people rediscover their family roots. We often take personal records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, passports for granted, assuming they will always be within easy reach. But what happens when those vital links are lost? Archives play an essential role in preserving these connections, especially for families who have been separated by migration or other historical events. Through today's session, we'll explore how archives can help piece together the lives of displaced individuals, shedding light on how this migration shaped not only their futures, but those of their descendants and the countries they helped to build. So following the presentations, we'll have a 30-minute Q&A session. So please feel free to share any questions in the chat as we go along. So thank you again for being here. And let's begin with our first presentation from Dr. Irene O'Brien, City Archivist at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow.
Good morning, everyone. As Audrey said, I'm from City Archives in Glasgow, so I want to talk about some of the ways you might find migrant children within our records and some of the other things that we've been doing around this issue. Just a very quick introduction. We have family history at the Mitchell here, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are family history resources. It's certainly a one-stop shop for the family historian. Today I'm going to concentrate on the City Archives itself, which includes Strathclyde Regional Archives. I will mention Scotland's People, though I know Tahitian's going to be talking about that. We also have special collections and we have the Health Board here, but today's talk is around the sources that you might use for this subject. I don't think there's any doubt in the City Archives and among the family history at the Mitchell. We've got everything from cradle to grave and everything in between. So it's a really amazing source which you should definitely be wanting to use. So I'm going to talk mainly about official records of the City Archives. Has the official records of both Glasgow, Strathclyde and a lot of the Strathclyde region and a lot of the county councils that made up Strathclyde, so a very vast area geographically that we have. We've got large numbers of private collections, but in the main today I want to talk about the official records, because these are the bodies responsible, or which we would use their records to find out about children who were sent to Canada. So one of the couple of things I'm going to start with schools, and we're very lucky. I think we actually have the school records for Quarriers. It's called the William Quarrier School in Bridge of Weir, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because that's one of the main sources for starting off your journey. It also gives those actually tell you what previous schools the children attended. It's not quite as simple as that. When I looked, sometimes a lot of them went to Quarriers Home before they ever went to school, so it doesn't give you that kind of detail. I'm going to also talk about the parochial boards, parish council minutes, etc., because they did have a responsibility for children who were orphaned, deserted, or separated from their family. And among those, I'm going to look at poor law records, poor law up to 1929, and after that, from public assistance, as a major source that you might hope to find people who had been migrated to Canada. And I'm going to look very at the kind of later period in terms of children in care, in terms of Glasgow Corporation. So in terms of William Quarrier School, Bridge of Weir, funnily enough, we had, and I don't know if anybody's attending from Quarriers Homes today, but we actually had quite a group of them in only a few weeks ago, and they were amazed at the depths of the collection that we have, and it's very clear that we have things that help tell this story, which don't exist in the homes themselves. So in terms of the school, it's a standard school. It's set up in Bridge of Weir. We have admission registers from 1894, so a very relatively early period. We've got left registers, and again, that kind of provides some similar information. We know the teachers because we've got registers there, and we've got these other things. So there's if you can see, there's quite a lot of varied things in terms of the William Quarrier School. We've got letter books, which will be miscellaneous. I'm not sure how general they are and whether they would give you a lot of information. We have financial records and we have correspondence, etc. So it's, I would say, one of the main sources of starting your journey for looking for people who have been sent from there to Canada. So in terms of the admission registers, just to give you the information, it looks pretty much like any other admission register. It gives you the name. It gives you the name of they were admitted. It tells you the date of birth, which is really crucial. It actually tells you when they exited, and it tells you where they went. And you can see just the right hand side there, maybe a bit faded. It says gone to Canada. And the first time I ever looked at these, I was amazed about the amount of people whose links listed there as having gone to Canada. Unfortunately, one thing it doesn't tell you, and part of the reason for that is they're under the supervision of the orphan homes. It doesn't give you their parents' names because the guardians are not their parents. So that's a bit of a disappointment. I can say that I have, and it does tell you the previous school they went to. I did try to make a quick check in the last few days to see if I could just fill in those gaps. Sometimes we have the school records that their original school. We don't always have, and we've got lots of school records. One of the issues is, are they early enough, and do we have the correct record for that? But it's certainly something that we need to be looking at. So it's got all of those lists of people who are in Quarriers School and would obviously be in the home from the early 20th century. So it's a really, really important source. It's very, very useful. As I say, that it has its limitations, but one of the things that really amazes me about it is how many places in Scotland these children came from. So when we look at it, the schools that are right across Scotland, from wide and far. Obviously, some of them are from Glasgow and the west of Scotland, but you'll see them from Edinburgh and Aberdeen. So it's a source that you would use to actually understand, if it's a child that you're interested in, actually understand other sources that you might use. So your ancestor may have come from Edinburgh, but you could look at that and it would give the school in Edinburgh, and they may or may not have that school, but it's certainly something worthwhile checking. So it is a really, really important source, and I think a source that's been underutilised, and possibly people didn't realise that it existed at all. And this is just another example of it. I've just told you much the same thing. I can't say I know Tahisha's going to talk about, well, she looked as if she was going to talk about statutory registers. I did try and check a couple of them because I don't have the name of the parents. It's very difficult to know who these people are because of that, but I was able to find some of them. So the one that I looked at earlier in the page before, the Barr family, I was able to find the birth certificate, because one of the things the register does give you is the exact date of birth, and from that, of course, I could find other details about their parents, etc. And interestingly, the other thing I double checked, so why did they end up there? The parents were actually, looked as if they were quite well off, but the father had died in 1902, and I think that was the explanation. It wasn't clear that the mother had died, and this was a second marriage. It wasn't clear that the mother had died, but at least it gives you those vital clues. So I suppose one of the things I'm saying is you may need something like this to get you started if you don't know enough, but you will switch obviously to the main statutory registers and the main resources that you would use for family history. So certainly I think it's really important and worthwhile checking. Now, I've taken out, because I was a very short time, I've taken out, in terms of the admission records, the admission records we hold for Glasgow and Strathclyde schools. We did make a huge attempt to make sure these all survived with a survey in 1983 for the Strathclyde, and in 1988 we went round all the Glasgow schools, we surveyed them and took in what they still had. There are some losses, but we do have an amazing collection of Glasgow school records. The other really important thing in terms of this, we're looking at those quarriers themselves, but the question is, how did they get there and why did they get there and who was responsible for them being there? So one of the most important things in terms of the records that are the poor law records, which we have for Glasgow and other areas of Strathclyde. It was started in 1845, ceased in 1930 before becoming up to 1948 public assistance. So it's laying down the system, including what records. Sadly, there's been large-scale losses across Scotland, so Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee don't have very many to talk about at all. Glasgow City Archives has about 1 million applications for Glasgow itself, covering a period up to 1948. So a huge collection which you might be wanting to use, and I'll tell you why you might think that that's an important place to start. And we also have buttes, a bit Western Bartonshire, South Lanarkshire and Renfrewshire, so quite a lot of others as well. And I did say at the beginning about how these the people who were attending William Quarrier School obviously came from not only Glasgow and the surrounding area, they came from across other areas in Scotland. So once you have looked at that, you may want to check in terms of poor law and in terms of schools what they might have. So we have general registers of applications, and we often showcase Glasgow because it not only gives you all the bare minimum, which I'm not going to talk about today, but what it does is give you a lot of details that explain the lives of the people who are applying for poor relief, in immense details, not always very complimentary. Sometimes they'll write in the top of the application like drunk, or an imbecile, or a lunatic, things you may not want to hear, but they will also make comments about moral behaviour and describe, if they visit their house, they'll describe the situation there. So we have one that an inspector visited a woman in Glasgow and said that she was making eyes at him, and she was nothing more than a prostitute. So you get all sorts of these comments. So Glasgow sometimes gives you letters, there's a lot of press cuttings and things. So one of the things it does, it actually gives you a real insight and a connection to the families that we're talking about here. Okay, and I just said, I think it was just below there, I should say part of the issue is they do have boarded out children, and a lot of children who were boarded out would have been would be eventually children. They were responsible for children who were orphaned, deserted or separated. So sometimes these boarded out volumes and cards are something to be checked, but I'll come back to that in a minute. This is just an application, not in any way one that deals with this issue. I did try my best to actually see if I could find one. Sadly, our database system's been down for about 2 weeks, but it's not always that easy to match it up, but certainly it's one of the things you ought to be doing and ought to be checking, because certainly the poor law authorities had responsibilities in this area. And this application here is from a Janet Roberts of Cleghorn, and I'm just trying to give you an idea of the detail you might be able to find. She's in Gamgad's Hill, front up, second right, so we know exactly where she was and where she was living, to the exact close. Mostly the close will not exist. It tells you her place of birth, so that's really interesting. It tells you her husband is in the Royal Infirmary. She's 37 and she's a housewife. And a disability. You could only get poor relief. You didn't get it for being unemployed. It was for being sick or disabled or unable to work. And this woman says her disabilities children. She did have 15 of them, so I understand that that's obviously a possibility that she was having a hard time. So it's giving you all sorts of details that you may want to have a look at. In terms of the boarded out children, I want to go back to that in particular because these are the individuals that we're interested in here. We do have boarded out volumes, which are registers of children who were boarded out to other areas. There was a great belief that started in the 18th century that children would be better off living in the countryside or whatever, rather than living in the city, and they would be often sent across Scotland, and they would be hosted there by families. These exist for Glasgow from about the 1870s to about the 1940s. So really interesting in terms of, it does list the children who were there. The boarded out volumes, and there are cards also, but the boarded out volumes don't give you a lot of detail. They're arranged geographically, so they will give you, see somebody was in Inverness, it will give you areas of Inverness. It tells you why they're there. It lists all the children who are boarded out in a particular house. It tells you why they were there, and it tells you, it will say whether they're separated or whatever. It's very interesting when I looked very carefully to see if it listed children boarded out to Bridgewere, and it does not do that, which suggests the council in a sense has, it wouldn't be the council at that stage, suggests they have been in a sense passed that responsibility on, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So they are arranged by the geographic location, and they do give the PULO application details. That's not to say the people that have been searched may not have been boarded out previously, so it's always worthwhile thinking that we may find it that way. The PULO application details, occasionally it doesn't work, but mostly it leads you right to the application. They're much more interesting. The boarded out volumes, it's good to see it there, but the reality is where you find all the detail is in the application themselves. And as I say, Quarters is not given as a location at all. But we do know it's absolutely clear that the responsibility lies with the parochial boards who later became parish councils. So we've got the minutes, it records the number of orphans, deserted children. It gives figures for children. Very often it will give figures for children who were sent to Canada. And there are discussions for applications for migration in terms of people wanting children to go to Canada, for instance. One of the reasons I know, but this, and I'm going to be talking about some other things I discovered, one of the reasons that migration was one of the topics the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry dealt with. So we all had to look at that and see what was happening in terms of that. And when you look at the parish council, which is kind of pre that date, it actually, there's discussions about whether they would allow children to be migrated to places like Canada. It doesn't give you any of the names, but it does underline that these children were at one time the responsibility they may have passed across, but at one time were absolutely the responsibility of the parochial board and then the parish council. So certainly worthwhile looking to see about that. So I just want to say very quickly, just to finish off, I don't want to go over, but in terms of the children in care, there are a number of options that you want to be looking at. We want to be looking particularly at the school records for William Quarrier, because for very often that's the start that you're going to need. It will give you the dates of the births of the children, it will tell you when they were admitted, and it tells you when they were left, and it tells you where they went. Now, a lot of them didn't go to Canada, and you see less and less of that, but there were huge numbers, and it does amaze you when you look at that and discover how many of them there are there. So you're looking at those school records. Hopefully, for across Scotland, that these Quarrier school records might give you the option of double checking what school records exist in other areas of Scotland, because it's very clear that the Quarriers in Bridge of Weir were taking children from across Scotland. So you need to think maybe about that quite narrow resource as a resource for checking right across Scotland, even if you know that your ancestor was from Aberdeen or Inverness or whatever. It's not impossible that they have ended up there, so it's worthwhile checking that as well. I don't think there's any doubt that the poor law is a particularly important role in terms of if we can find that we've got an application for them. Very often, if a parent dies or somebody has been orphaned, you might, even before that stage, you might find the applicant, the father, the mother had applied for poor relief before. Sometimes you will get applications in names of the children. One of the issues that may arise is before it even got to that stage, they were sent to a place like Quarriers and eventually to Canada. But these are really, really important resources in terms of doing the family history and understanding all the different things that might have happened and making sure we double check that. And even as late, as I say, we worked in the child abuse inquiry in terms of the migration. As you can see, it's very clear for those later stages and maybe the earlier stages, it was not local authorities that were responsible for that agreement. The ones that we actually found in Glasgow from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and particularly beyond that, is that people asked to take their child away to a place like Canada or to send them, or organisations asked. Very often the council would agree, but with the proviso that the Secretary of State for Scotland agreed to it also. So you maybe want to think about what's in the National Records of Scotland in terms of that permission that they gave for a child to be migrated to a place that was not their home. So certainly, again, think about that as well. So thank you very much, and a really interesting subject. And as I say, it's very close to our what we're doing just now in terms of the child abuse inquiry, because all of these things are thrown up with that, and it's interesting to just see what can happen in a situation like that, that in terms of the authorities who are nominally responsible may have passed that responsibility elsewhere. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Irene, for that, and the wonderful resource that you have at the Mitchell Library. I'm quite sure lots of people will be familiar with it, but I know we have quite a lot of people on this webinar today from Canada. So we've sent the link into the chat for everyone, and you will be receiving that later. So don't worry if you can't write it down or anything like that. You will be getting it later on. I want to move on to our next speakers, I'm going to say. So this particular session will have two speakers. We have Tahisha McCabe, who's head of Strathclyde Institute for Genealogical Studies, and Ian Mooney, who is a tutor on Strathclyde's MSc in Genealogical and Heraldic and Paleographic Studies. So I'm going to pass over to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Yeah, I've been asked to give a general rundown on where to start with doing genealogy and talking about some resources based here in Scotland. So just to give a general idea that most folks will it's a good place to start with genealogy research, is writing down what you know about your family, even if it's like the tiniest little tidbit of information. All of that information can help, and I find it amazing how much I start remembering about my parents, my siblings, etc., when I start writing things down. So that's really useful, and it's, as I say, anything that you can think of for yourself, for your later earlier generations, and so on and so forth. And then if you do have someone, other folks around, siblings, aunts, uncles, family, friends, all of that. If you're fortunate, parents, grandparents, talk to them about what they know about the family, because if you, particularly if you have older siblings or even younger siblings, they'll have a different take. Maybe different stories have been told to them about what happened with the family, and you can add all of that information into the hopper. So. But also, just to warn you that things people might tell you might not be true, or they might have bits of truth. So you're going to then need to check that information with what you can find in the record sets. So yeah, just, yeah, as I say, hold on to that, but don't take it as writ. I would say the basic facts which are really useful for you to take down, if you can, for folks in your family tree, are the ones that are on the screen. It's kind of I suppose the skeleton of information that you can then, and once you know that, you can then go on and hopefully find out the stories about what happened to folks. Um, Another thing that I find really useful, a lot of genealogists, family historians, will start working on a project or a question, and you find some interesting information, and you get segued. I always think of it as chasing the shiny balls of information, and you get sidetracked, and you never actually end up answering the question that you set out to answer. So I always try to have a general plan for my research when I sit down, either at an archive or in front of my computer, and think, what is it that I'm trying to find today? I'll even like write it on a post-it note or put it into a Word document, and that just helps me really focus my mind about what it is that I'm trying to get at. Yeah, can be simple, can be elaborate. If you're starting out on a big research project, you might want to brainstorm with yourself, maybe brainstorm with other people about types of records, um, time periods, all that kind of thing that might be useful to you. Um, and once I've done that, then as I'm going through the research, it's incredibly, I mean, it's crucial really to track down, to note down what it is that you found, and perhaps even more importantly, what you haven't found. So I use an Excel spreadsheet to do this. I have what's called a research log that I've created myself on an Excel spreadsheet. But there's lots of these types of research logs that you can download, blank copies of these. I've given a couple of links to a website called Cindy's List. It's an amazing resource for all sorts of things, but she has links to blank charts, family group sheets that you can use to capture information as you go. I would suggest using a pencil if you're writing things down by hand rather than pen, so you can scratch things out, erase things, put things in, because you may very well find that you've taken down details for the wrong person, and rubbing those out can be quite useful. The reason why I say it's really important to note down what's not been fruitful, that you've not found, is that in the future you can go back and say, oh, okay, I didn't find that bit of information. These are the places that I looked, because databases and archives, they put new information up. New things have been digitized, new things have been transcribed, or new catalogs, entries have been made in archives. So you can then see, oh, actually, there's a new thing here. I've looked there before, but I'll go and look there again. And hopefully that next time you'll actually find something that's useful. So yes, just general tools that I've noted already. Blank family tree is really useful. There's lots of software out there, many different types of family tree software, and those are good for noting down all of the information on the family connections that you find. But you can also use resources like online trees on Ancestry, so you can create a tree yourself if you have a subscription to Ancestry or Find My Past, or there's lots of different places that offer these. So where to find information? One tip that I would say is to think about the individual or the family and how they would have interacted with authority. And I'm using that term really broadly. So that could be the government, that could be the church, that could be but clubs, and think about, were they born? And all of us were born. All of us die. But in between, other things may or may not have happened. But did they were they a publican? Did they apply for a pub license? Did they travel? So the passenger list. Did they go into poor relief? All of these records are places that you can look. But it's useful to think about your family, what you know about your family, and think, oh, right, they were in this area, they probably went to school, so I'll look for school records in that area. Um, there's lots of different databases that are available. Ancestry, Find My Past, Family Search, or but Scotland's People, if you're looking for Scottish folks, Scotland's People is probably your primary place to look. Many other databases have what's called transcribed information. So that's information that's been, people have looked at the actual record and then typed it out, written it in. But what I often find about transcriptions is they don't include all of the information that's on the record. People might have made mistakes, so it's always useful to look at the actual record if you possibly can. And Scotland's People has things like the Scottish Census records, civil government-created birth, marriage, and death, lots of church records, and so on and so forth. So you can access those online via credits, or if you're fortunate enough to be in Scotland, you can go to in-person Scotland's People Centre and pay a flat fee for a day and get access to as many things as you can humanly look up and then save. So. And I would also, as Irene said, using archives, either the online presence or in person, is really crucial, particularly if you're looking for folks like the home children, where many of those records haven't been digitized yet. So yeah, to get actually contact with archives is crucial. So. What if you can't find somebody? If they're just unfindable, you've looked and looked and looked, and people can be impossible to find for lots of different reasons. You might have a common name that you're dealing with, James Campbell. There might be 30 James Campbells who were born in Glasgow on the particular day, for example. Knowing which one can be really hard, unless you know more about that person or their family. People decide to vanish on purpose. So, if that can just be really, really challenging to track people. But what I would potentially suggest, if you're really running into you just can't find anything about family or a person, is that DNA testing might be able to help, and that can help you connect with other people who have done DNA testing and show that you're related. And those people might know more about your family and thus be able to share it with you. So there are some issues around DNA testing. You need to be mindful of the kind of information that you might find. You might find, for example, that the people you think are your biological parents aren't your biological parents. You might discover that you have siblings from your parents that you didn't know about. So it's things to really think about before doing DNA testing. Yeah, so uh, there are lots of places to learn more. We offer a couple of free online courses through outfit called Future Learn. One of these is about research methodology. That's the researching your family tree. And if you're curious about DNA testing, the class that we run on DNA testing covers the basics. So you don't have to know anything about DNA testing before taking that. We also offer some courses which are much more Scottish focused, but then there's lots of how-to guides out there that are free to access that talk about how to do research, but also in great depth about the actual record types themselves and how they're useful. Um, and please feel free to contact us. These contact details will be shared, but happy to help talk about the courses that we offer to point you in the right direction with your research. So thanks so much.
Sorry, I realised I was still muted, which wasn't going to help anyone. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about specific home children records. I'm looking at this, I'm doing some research on a group of children who left Liverpool to go to Canada. There was a home in Liverpool run by a lady called Louisa Burt, and I'm looking at children there. What's very interesting as I go through the records is that a lot of these children do not come from Liverpool, and they do come from Scotland. They come from all over England and Wales. So one of the things I would say is if you're looking for records, don't always look in your hometown or the hometown that the child came from. They were moved around. And Irene talked about the poor law and things like that. Workhouses often sent children to Canada via one of the agencies because it was cheaper to send them to Canada than keep them for 7 years in a workhouse. So what are we looking at? If I can get this to work. So as I say, I'm looking at Liverpool. One of the things you should look at is lots of different archives. The records seem to have been split up in lots of places. So I've had to look at University of Liverpool, Liverpool City Archives, the Canadian National Archives, which are going to be talked about in a moment. But I've put that link there, but I'm sure later on our next speaker will probably give you far more information about that. What I would say, if you're looking definitely for home children, is I would start with the Canadian Archives. There's a very good database on there. And if you know the child's name, if you know their date of birth, you can put that in, and then you'll find out what ship they went out on, which party they went out with, and you may find more information there. But I always start there if I'm looking for specific children, because it also tells you the name of every child who went on that shipment. And that can be quite helpful if you're looking for siblings as well. This Knowlton is one of the distributing homes. It depends which agency the children went out with, but children I'm looking at, most of them ended up in a town called Knowlton, and there are archives there. The home is still there. Lots of these homes are still out there. They're not homes anymore. They've been turned into apartments and things, but you can go and see the town where your ancestor actually went to and potentially farmed or was in service not far from there. There are personal collections. One of the things I've done on lots of talks is I've been contacted by people who have a personal collection. They are descendants of the home children, and they've got lots of things. Somebody actually sent me a photograph of a military medal that was given to one of the home children who was killed in the Canadian forces. So there are lots of personal things out there as well. Barnardo's is probably the biggest agency that sent children out there, and they sent children from all over the UK. So I know we're talking about Quarriers today, but actually Barnardo's hold a lot of records. I'll show you a couple of records that are really important. I've just put the National Archives up there. The sorts of things we have that I've been looking at, the top ones are relatively straightforward, but the ship manifests are very important because that lists the children who went out there. And I'll show you a brief slide in a minute, which shows you something quite important on those ships manifests. There are some letters still existing from family and from the children back to the UK. These are the most important records. If you can find a children's case file, And if you are a direct descendant, Barnardo's will let you have access to that. If you're not, they won't. It's a private collection that Barnardo's do not let the general public see. But I'll show you a couple of case files in a minute where they have the most amazing information. A lot of children, as I say, came from workhouse, poorhouse, industrial schools, and those records are really important. And the Canadian Department for Agriculture records, which I maybe talked about later, are useful as well. And don't forget newspapers. A lot of these children, where they made their lives later on, they may be in newspapers. This is a ship that went out. It went out in 1898. There were 42 children on that ship. And if I look at this little family here, the Ashcroft family, this is them in 1891, living with their family. So it's just a census record in Liverpool. But it might be a little bit difficult to see, but on the right-hand side, so the top group of people on here are the children. And on the right-hand side, it says they're a party of 42 who went with Mrs. Burt, who was the lady who took them out there. It often says that on the ship's manifests, that they are part of a group, and it explains who they are and where they were going to. I'm afraid I've had to blur this out because Barnardo's don't particularly want me to show you everything in their records. And some of it's quite private, I suppose. But this is for all the children that went to Canada, if they went with Barnardo's or in this case, the Liverpool home, which Barnardo's took over, it'll tell us their dates of birth when they were taken into the home. Hidden behind that bit that I've sort of screened out is a lot of information about Rachel Ashcroft, including her parents, why she is in a home or why she's been admitted to a home. Some of those stories are quite harrowing. A lot of them are about a crisis in the family. A parent's died, the other parent can't cope, or a parent's remarried and the new stepmother, stepfather doesn't want the children and so on. But there is a lot of information there, including grandparents, aunts and uncles, all sorts of things like that. The second page has what they did in Canada. So if you can find a case file, it'll tell you the families they were with in Canada. And in this case, you can see in the summer of 1900, Rachel returned to England. There is a relatively large number who did actually come back to England. And that's her, when she got married, that's the 1939 record there. And it's got her date of birth there, 23rd of April, 1886. But we can follow her right through beyond there. If there's any questions from anyone, I'm quite happy to answer them separately. If you want to email me, I'm quite happy to do that. That's really as much as I need to say at the moment, I think.
Great. Thank you, Ian. We have so much information there. I don't know if people already are aware of all these databases and places to find. Perhaps if you have other ones, you could put them in the chat. It might be helpful for other people attending this webinar. If you've come across another source, that would be great. I just want to introduce, though, our last speaker, who is Nicole Wattier. Who is who works at the Library and Archives in Canada, and she is really going to tell us about what happens if you find you have a relative who went to Canada. How do you go about finding them? And they has lots of information actually about home children, and I'm sure Nicole is going to mention a few case studies as well. I'll pass you over to her. Thank you.
Good morning from Canada. My name is Nicole Wattier, and as said, I've been working with Library and Archives Canada for quite a while now, over 20 years, and 15 specifically in genealogy. So today we'll just do an overview of our website, who we are, Library and Archives Canada, and we'll delve into a couple of specific areas, namely immigration, home children, and take a look at a few other sources that might be useful. So I'm noticing actually that my internet quality is going down a bit as the day goes on. So while I'm sharing my presentation, I'll turn my camera off. So we're going to be tracing Scottish immigrants to Canada with Library and Archives Canada today. So I'd just like to explain a bit about land acknowledgements. So this is a way for us here in Canada to engage in reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples, to honor the relationship they have with the land, and to recognize the history and harms of colonization as we gather here today. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. This community has a strong traditional tie to the land, and we extend our gratitude to them for allowing us to continue our work here today. So as an institution, we're committed to listening and uplifting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and ensuring that their histories are shared and their voices are heard for many generations to come. So introducing Library and Archives Canada. So Library and Archives Canada combines the former National Library of Canada and the National Archives of Canada into one institution. And our mandate is to preserve the documentary heritage of Canada for the benefit of present and future generations, and to serve as the continuing memory of the Government of Canada and its institutions. So we have a few locations. So our main location is in Ottawa, the nation's capital, but we have regional offices in Halifax, Winnipeg, as well as Vancouver. So in addition to genealogy, we have different services to the public. So reference services, if you have a question about just general Canadian history, politics, music, literature. We have on-site consultation. So if somebody's coming in to take a look at a particular book or archival material, we have copy services, and we have access to information and privacy, legal deposit. So legal deposit is how Library and Archives Canada collects at least one copy of materials published in Canada. So some of our holdings. So we have a few things in our collections. Government and private archives, as well as published documents. So countless documents, books, magazines, photos, music, films. So as you can see, over 20 million books published in various languages. A whole bunch of kilometers of private records, government records. As you can see, newspapers from across Canada as well. So this is a screenshot of our website. It's usually long, but I've had to do it in 2 and 2. So our website changed about a couple of years ago. So it now complies with guidelines and templates set out by our government. So at the top of the page, Library and Archives Canada, a small description. You'll find a box called Collection Search where you can do a quick search. There's some image tiles that change from time to time. Then under Most Requested, you'll find, of course, the most popular things that keep being requested. And these topics do change from time to time. However, genealogy and family history is always there. Beneath that, you'll see some news items. You'll see if there's a statutory holiday and we're closed, or if there's a technical issue with our website sometimes. We have a couple of feature tiles, as well at the bottom of the page, you have our social media. So again, if there's a technical issue, sometimes it'll be in the news items as well as on social media. Our genealogy and family history page. So you'll see there's 6 topic pages that are linked to image tiles. So these tiles do change from time to time, but for the moment, they're pretty well static. So we have 1 to how to begin your genealogy research, very general, aimed at, just beginners. We have census records, birth, marriage, and death records. Canadian Library and Archives Canada only has a small collection of those. In Canada, birth, marriage, and death records are a provincial jurisdiction mainly. immigration records, of course, military history, and we have a tile for citizenship and naturalization. Just a little note on that, because we're one big happy Commonwealth family, you won't find really any Scottish or English or Irish people applying for naturalization. So if you scroll down a bit further down to the page, you'll have all of our other topics listed in a kind of a table chart. So you can filter your options by subtopic, or just put in a keyword to see if there's anything that we have. So our immigration records page. So at the top of the page, you'll see a few common sense tips, advice to get started. And if you scroll down to places to look, this is the nitty-gritty here. So you'll look for records of arrival and then open the drop down to passenger lists to 1935. So Scottish people have been immigrating to Canada since the 1600s, actually, but there are no comprehensive passenger lists before 1865. So in 1865, the government started requiring shipping companies to keep records and to send them on to the government. So that's why the date is 1865 is quite important when you're searching for immigrants. So we do have a bunch of databases to search. As you know, we were a French colony as well, so French regime, and then a British colony as well. So today I'm going to take a quick little sample search under the database called Passenger List for the Port of Quebec City and Other Ports 1865 to 1922, where it's bracketed search by name. So here is the search screen. So I put a surname, Greenhorn, and I'm using for a given name ROB with an asterisk. So that's in case what's on the actual passenger list is Robert, the full name, or ROBT, or Robert and perhaps a middle name or middle initial. You don't have to put in all the other boxes. Sometimes the less information you put in is a bit more, give you better results. So here's a sample result for Rob Greenhorn. So you'll see the image of the passenger list. So it's a list of names and ages. Sometimes on passenger lists, you'll see in first class or saloon class, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And then beside the age column, it'll just say A for adults. So sometimes the information given on passenger lists is really very scanty. So in this case, it's a list of names, ages, and a destination, Halifax. So our transcription gives a bit of information, but not exactly what we're looking for. Also, I'll just mention, in Canada, there was this big trend in the 1950s and 60s to microfilm records. They thought it would be, this great new technology would save a lot of space. So yes, the Department of Immigration did microfilm all passenger lists and then thought, okay, well, we don't need the original records, so let's destroy them. So what we're left with is microfilm reels, now digitized, but however, the quality varies. Sometimes the image looks like a Tasmanian devil ripped through it. So it makes a lot of the names very difficult to see. So to make things easier for our researchers looking for home children, we suggest using our home children records database. You can also use our Board of Guardians database as well. But specifically for couriers, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 random entries. You'll want to use the Home Children Records database. However, as previously mentioned by Irene and Ian, people moved around. So you might as well check if there's a database there, might as well check it. So this is a bit further down our page as well, the Home Children page, for other sources that we do have. So here's home records, home children records database. So before we take a look at this in closer detail, I just want to give a lot of credit to our indexing partners, the British Isles Family History Society of Greater Ottawa, who are fabulous and have indexed so many of these records. The records in this database come from passenger lists, as well as immigration branch correspondence, so Department of Agriculture files, different reports, and non-government collections as well. So I did a quick search, and here is Robert Greenhorn. So we have a bit of additional information to what we see on the passenger list. So we have the same information, so his name, but we have a bit more information. So we have the date of departure from Glasgow, date of arrival, port of arrival. We have the party, so Warriors Orphan Homes of Scotland, destination Brockville, Ontario. There's a link if you want to click it to see all the names of the children traveling together on this particular ship. And in the comments, we have some specific data about how many boys were coming over, and some notes about how difficult it was to read the names, as well as the other archival references here at Library and Archives Canada. So what our indexers did was they not only looked at the actual passenger list, but they went forward and back in the passenger list. So this little document was found, I think, a few pages on, and it was turned upside down. So this is basically the statistical tabulations of who is on this list, on the passenger list. So you'll see there's saloon or first class passengers, intermediate, steerage, third class, but also it's specifically pointing to courier boys. So there was 69 males over age of 12 and 60 males under between 1 and 12 years old. So we also hold juvenile inspection reports. So these records date mainly from 1920 to 1932. So these are much later in the period. So there's usually one card per child, gives the usual information, sending organization, names, addresses of employers, wages paid. Final comment, sometimes it'll say their indentures completed or have gone west. So the quality of the microfilm images is poor. As I said, these records were microfilmed in the 50s, 60s. Our archival standards weren't really sort of respected. So the microfilm is digitized and available for free on our partner website called Canadiana Heritage. So here's an example for John Shearer. It gives his age, 16, so an older person, as well as his date of birth. It shows the year immigrated, union, non-union, immigrated by courier. So on the left-hand side of the page, you'll see the dates of inspection. And if you look in the other columns, I know they're super hard to see. You'll see character of the home itself and G, those are all G's. That means good. The health of the child, satisfaction given, child's character, terms. So terms means wages paid. So I think that was mainly for ages 14 and older. The name of the employer, their postal address, their county, and as well here, just to note, a lot of times you'll find here in Canada, we recycle place names. So you'll see a county called Lanark. So that's just near here, Ottawa, just probably southwest. So in this case, it shows that the indenture was completed, and there's actually a note. So sometimes you'll see remarks. So this boy left, and it gives the date, and is employed by an LG Tully. So it gives where this place is located. And it says the boy did not leave Mr. Best through any dissatisfaction, but by reason that of the fact that he had attained his 18th birthday and had completed his indenture. So that's nice little facts to know. You can also search our general collection search. So that's government private records. You can just do a keyword search with Scotland, Scottish, Scotch, emigration, immigration, a place name, or the name of an organization. And you can filter your results if you get a whole bunch. So for many home children, there are no real records from the organization that showed with whom they stayed in Canada. So this is where census returns can help. So federal census returns are the official government of Canada records that enumerate the country's population. So you can find a treasure trove of biographical information, name, year of birth or age, place of birth or country of birth. For example, it'll be written Scotland or England. Position in the household, so head, wife, grandson, boarder, and in particular, you want to look for domestic. So each census has a unique list of questions, and the nominal census federally was taken every 10 years. For our western provinces, so that's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, another census was taken every 10 years, but on the 5. So you'll have more census records for the prairie provinces than you will for a province like Ontario or Quebec or the Maritimes. The geographical area covered by each census varied significantly over the years. And I would say take all information found on a census, on census returns with a grain of salt. Depending on who's giving the information to the enumerator, perhaps a farmer giving information about their home child is not 100% accurate. Sometimes a home child themselves don't know their exact age or date of birth, that sort of thing. So we suggest trying to look through more than just one census if you can. So here's our census search form. Under when, you can pick your year. So once you have a date of immigration, you can check the next census. If you don't have a year of immigration, there's a couple of censuses that give a year of immigration, like 1901 or 1911. So under who, you can put in a name. You don't have to fill in the rest of the information if you don't know it. So here's a result for our Robert Greenhorn in the 1891 census. So as you can see, there's some transcribed information. So we'll blow this up a bit. So you can see Robert Greenhorn is residing in the household of Alonzo King. So Alonzo is kind of misspelled there. So Robert is a male. He's age 12. He's single, a domestic, born in Scotland. His father was born in Scotland, as well as his mother. The religion practiced is Methodist. And further on the columns, there's a couple of dash marks that indicate that Robert can read and write. So a few other records that can help fill in the story. So military records. So the Canadian Expeditionary Force records, those are files that are digitized on our website that you can take a look at. So think of somebody who's born in the 1860s to late 1890s. They may have served. And in those files, you'll find biographical information as well. So think about as well, if you think your home child was a nursing sister, it could be she served as well. So many actually served with the British Expeditionary Force. So that's another avenue to take a look at. Also take a look for biographies and histories of the children. Your local librarian can help you find that out. If your ancestor was a home child with a particular, say for Bernardos or Quarriers, look for biographies of other children from that organization. There's tons of newspaper articles, as mentioned, but also look in provincial archives here in Canada, as well as local museums, local libraries, local archives. So on our website, we do have a blog called the Discover blog. So it's at the bottom of the main page with those social media buttons. So I'd like you to take a look at, in your own time, a blog post. It's a 4-part series called Discovering My Grandfather, Robert Roy Greenhorn, a home child, by our colleague Beth Greenhorn. So it's a 4-part series that traces Robert's beginnings in Scotland, his journey to Canada, and Beth's research steps along her journey of discovery. So it's also noted in the blog post that Robert Greenhorn's brothers were also Quarrier boys. You may also wish to listen to one of our podcasts. It's one of our early ones. It's from about 10 years ago. But it's with a former colleague of ours, as well as with the late John Sayers, who was a member of, or the project coordinator for many years for the British Isles Family History Society of Greater Ottawa. I really don't think Mr. Sayers understood how much people appreciated his work, which actually started way back in the 1990s. So our genealogy services has prepared an extensive home children resource guide that might help you with your research. So it includes background information on the juvenile immigration movement, information about records held here at LAC and a few other places, information and resources for the different sending organizations and receiving homes, and some links to home children websites. So you can request a copy of our guide in PDF format by getting in touch with us. So how to do that? You'll see a link in the chat, but from our main page, you can go to the bottom under Ask Us a Question and ask genealogy a question. So you don't have to visit Library and Archives Canada in person. You can do a lot of research from your own home and send in your questions, and we'll be happy to help in any way we can. So thanks for listening today.
Thank you, Nicole, actually. That was really fascinating. Wonderful. One question that came up, and I'm just going to ask, and it actually might go to all the speakers, but it was during Nicole's talk, was, are there any personal testimonies from the children themselves? Do you have that?
For Library and Archives Canada, I would say in published format, you might find some biographies if children have wanted to speak. I know for more recently, the past 20 years you'll find a lot of our news organizations who focused as well on telling the children's stories, especially with here in Canada, British Home Child Day coming up in not this Saturday, but Saturday next. You'll see more and more stories across news organizations.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, something I saw, I was in Canada earlier this year and I went and visited Pier 21, the Immigration Museum, and they do have oral histories of some children that are part of it. So that's something, I'm not sure that's available online though, but we do have a blog on our website, the SCA website, which will be included in the links that you'll receive after the webinar. So you can read that blog as well. I think you'd find that useful. Now, I don't know. Oh, sorry, Ian, carry on.
There are some published books. There's 2 or 3 published books from the 1980s where the authors did interview surviving people who had been home children. So there are a few. I know Melville and Bean is one, and there are a couple of others where they have some interviews with them.
Yeah, and someone who sent me a direct message in the chat is Marcy, who says Ups and Downs magazine told the personal stories of Bernardo. So Looking Children Canada, Looking Home Children Canada. So that is something maybe for everyone to do. I don't know if there is a link, but that would be a great resource. I am going to say, please do post your questions in the chat, but you can also go to the bottom of your screen and you will see React. And if you do want to raise your hand, I will look out, and George will also be looking out for you. If you do want to ask a question, please feel free to let us know. In the meantime, I do want to ask a couple of questions that came up earlier. I think one of them is really maybe, Tahisha, to you, because you sort of spoke a little bit about DNA testing. I don't know if you could expand on that a little bit. Tell us your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's something that can be really helpful for people who are adopted, really don't have much information about their biological family, and even if you do know about your you know, or you think you know about your biological family, it can be helpful in making connections and just helping you perhaps know more about your ancestry. But there are different types of tests for men and women. But the most useful one is called an autosomal test, and that's really helpful for tracing ancestry back about 5 generations. So for the kind of the home children time frame, that would be quite useful. It's useful for both men and women because it's not testing the sex chromosome, the Y chromosome, and they're and there are a number of companies that do this type of test. Um, and what for genealogy purposes, what the most useful thing is to do the test and then look at the people that you match with. And there is different levels of matching, like me and my mom, the test shows that biologically and thankfully the person that I thought was my mother is showing as my mother. And I'm saying these things because I know many people who have tested and they've discovered it's usually the father, but it can happen that you discover that you're adopted and you didn't realize that you were adopted. I also know a lot of folks who their biological family ends up being whom they thought, but they discover siblings or half siblings that they didn't know about from relationships that their parents had. So it's really something to be aware of the potential problems, or the information that these tests may bring up that you might not anticipate. A lot of folks get these tests for presence and that find out how much percentage of Irish you have, and the kind of bio geography, as we ethnicity is not a great term for this, but that kind of information that you get back is interesting, but it changes, and it's really about the other people, the um, marker information that they have, the testing companies have, and it's like I've seen my percentages shift across time with the same test from like 38% Irish to now I'm down to 6% Irish, and it just depends on how much information. So anyway, but in terms of finding out information about matching, it can be really useful in getting you clued into people you might not know about. So.
No, that's great, because I think that is the thing with these DNA testing databases. It's you're being compared to those that are already being tested, and it's on their system. So it's not everybody in the world.
No.
it's who they've got samples of. So it is something to bear in mind. And maybe just on that, actually, I mean, are there sort of, you mentioned a company, like when you come to databases as well, I mean, is there some that you would always go to that you would prefer to use rather than?
Yeah, well, when I'm thinking about which genealogy database to use, I always start with, well, what's the question that I'm trying to answer? And you know, there are the big kind of general databases like Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past that have information from a large number of different countries and places. So those are all really powerful. Often they will contain the same records, but they do hold records from different places. So uh, so yeah, I mean, I have subscriptions to Ancestry and Find My Past, and I have a Family Search is provided through the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it's not, you don't pay for it. You have to create a sign in, but they hold information for not just that religion, but for many, many, many countries and not different religions and so on and so forth. So they have records that other places don't have, and it's a really quite powerful resource. But as I said, for Scottish, really, I always come back to using Scotland's people because Ancestry and Find My Past do have transcribed information, and that could be a useful place to start for Scottish research, particularly with the census and things like that. But particularly Ancestry, I find with the Scottish census has some howlers in their transcriptions. It's so yeah, but Scotland's people definitely. And if you can get to a Scotland's people center in person, that's really a great way to go. There's one that in the Mitchell, in it's right next to the city archives, also in Edinburgh, but they're dotted around Scotland. You need to make a reservation though, and book your seat. So.
Good. No, thank you. I think in response to that, there's Kim Farrell who has sent a direct message, and I think I've said to Kim, why don't you unmute and maybe ask or tell us about what you were talking about.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually calling, I'm from Alberta, Canada. I am a descendant of actually 2 British home children that came from couriers. So I'm finding this fascinating because I am still working on one of my older lines, and you've given me some links to help me out. But in regards to National British Home Child Day, that was come into effect by the Canadian government, and I think it was 2017. And the Home Children Canada has done a campaign called Beacons of Light. And what we do is try to encourage people to have illuminations on government buildings or bridges, and proclamations from cities, as well as any kind of presentations that people want to perform, over that time. So currently, I actually sent you a list, but you can find it on the Home Children Canada Facebook page. I'm actually the kind of the coordinator for that, and we've gone as far as Australia and parts of England as well. So we're hoping to grow that list. So if there's anybody out there that would like to do an illumination on September 28th, we encourage you to do so, as well as put your porch light on too. So I think this is a fabulous thing, and we're really pushing our country here to encourage them to recognize these children. It's very important. So thank you.
No, thank you, Kim, for saying that. I don't think we have something similar here for people who have got a home child within their family tree, if you like. So it'd be nice to recognize them actually. After the webinar we did on Tuesday around the Golden Bridge project, they're sort of forgotten people, as if they didn't exist. And yeah, it's good if we could actually talk about it and make it something that people do know more about actually. People have been sending me, Karen has sent me something, Karen Backhouse, and I don't know if Karen would like to just unmute as well, but she might not. Hi. Yeah. Hi, okay. We can hear you. I could hear you. Hi.
That's better. I'm from Liverpool Hope University, and we have a very small collection of archives from Nugent Care, which is a Catholic charity that started with Father Nugent back in the mid-19th century, Liverpool. I have to say, for genealogy purposes, most of the records of the homes that were set up by Nugent belong at the Liverpool Records Office, Central Library, and that's where to look for those. But we have a small collection of archives, which includes some of the published magazines, such as Homeless, which Father Nugent, they actually printed at one of the children's homes. And in that, they published some of the, they printed some of the letters that the children wrote home. However, obviously they've chosen happy ones, perhaps. But however, that they are there.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, actually,
Okay.
Karen. Could I ask maybe a question relating to this, and it's maybe really for Irene in some ways, with your regard to the sort of the child abuse inquiry in the Freedom of Information Act. Are certain archives, can they be banned? Like, can, say, Quarriers in Scotland say, no, you can't access them? Or is it different laws in Scotland than it is to England, or not? Oh, you're on mute, Irene. No.
Sorry, data protection is obviously a UK-wide thing, so it's data protection rather than freedom of information we're talking about here. I don't know why they closed them, and we probably would have 100 years closure for people. That would be what we would normally do. But they may have a reason for it, you know, and certainly if we were told that by our authority, we'd have no choice but to stand by what they have said,
Okay.
you know, so we don't have that freedom to open up what is a local authority record. So it will come through to us in terms that we do, because the child abuse inquiry, I cannot tell you how many we do. If those of you are interested in migration and what it had to say about the child abuse inquiry, I mean, I can send a link because there's a big report being written about it. It goes back mainly to 1930, but it might deal with a bit earlier. So it's worthwhile if you're really interested in what was happening in Scotland during that period. There'll be a very comprehensive report written by an expert on the situation in terms of migration of children.
That would be great, actually, Irene, and we can send that out for people. I think that'd be really helpful, actually. Thank you. I'm also sorry, I'm aware of the time, and I just maybe wanted to say that Amanda has put a very long bit of information in my chat. Don't know if Amanda, if you just want to sort of summarize that with telling us, because it looks very interesting about your thesis. Are you, Amanda? No. I don't know if Amanda's she's writing her thesis on British home children. And there is Amanda. Amanda, sorry. Would you like to say it rather than me reading out your text?
So the first thing I had sent you was a list of books that are available. I have some of them right here that are based on real stories of British home children, whether they're compiled in short stories or whether it's somebody who has put one up of their own family. And then there is things like this. If you've got Bernardo's, this is the memoirs of Dr. Bernardo, put out by his wife 2 years after he died. And there are all kinds of books by Gillian Wagner, Joy Parr, that have produced books about British home children. It started a lot in the 80s, but there's been periodic books throughout the whole of the 20th century. But as for my thesis, I am looking at a specific case out of Scotland on philanthropic abduction. And that was a term coined by Bernardo, where he felt that the family was going to interfere, and he spirited them away to Canada, and then was like, well, I don't know where they are, so they can't have them back. I don't know, they're gone. Good luck. And so I'm looking at a case specifically out of Scotland that the court case I have access to is this case looks remarkably like Bernardo's case. And I'm looking at a time where the laws were just starting to change in the late 1880s. So it's it's a fascinating time where it was just a perfect storm of, we've got the beginning of social work. They weren't quite called social workers yet. They were called visitors, where they would go in and say, like, you need more help. And the philanthropy was starting to look at children, and they were changing the definition of children. The upper class was changing the definition of children and making it more into what we recognize as childhood now. And this was the upper class, and they were looking at the working class saying, well, you're not keeping up. So some of the laws that were happening in the late 1880s, early 1890s, were laws that were making it easier for the government, for these visitors to go in and say, you're unfit, I'm taking your child, and making it 10 times harder for, at least 10 times harder for parents to get their children back. And that's, they sold it as doing what was best for these children. Dr. Bernardo himself, he published a lot of pamphlets. He called one was called Kidnapped, that I'm looking at in my thesis, where it was promotional work, but I think it was, so it was a fictional story as far as I can determine, but I think it was based on maybe some of his true interactions, where he goes in and he sees these two children looking into like a restaurant, and they're starving, and he gets them food, and he ends up taking them back home and finding out that they live with a mother brown that they call Granny. And he ends up stealing these children and sending them away to Canada, because he didn't see that their lives were better. There's another one that I'm looking at that's called Never Had a Home. And he's again recounting the story of this woman who comes to him and says, please take my 3 children. I want them to be raised better than what I have. I haven't had a home. My children have never had a home. We'd go into the workhouse when I was pregnant for a couple of weeks. And then after I had the baby, we'd be off in the streets again. And my husband died 3 years ago, and I want something better for them. And he said he took them in, got her a job. She ended up not being able to stay, because she's like, I haven't had a home for so long. I can't stand being in the factories. And he kept the children and gave them a good life. And when he'd taken them in, he said, there's a chance they could go to Canada. And she's like, I understand. And as the oldest daughter was getting to be a middle teen, like 14, 15, he saw the mother coming back and being like, seeing how lonely she was. And he said that I've seen this before. So he spirited them to Canada. So he was promoting it based on, I'm doing what's best for these children, because society at the time believed that if you were poor, it was a moral failing.
Yeah.
And not due to not having access to an income, because this is also during the Industrial Revolution, and people are moving to the cities. So great big slums were starting up because, people didn't care about the amount of homes and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot more into it, but.
Yeah, Amanda, I'm going to say actually some of this was sort of mentioned actually in the first webinar that was on Tuesday, the Golden Bridge Project.
The first one.
Yeah, no, well, it's recorded, so don't worry. You can access it, and you can look at the actual project, because we put the link into the chat as well, and you'll get those links as well afterwards. I think we really have to call it a day there.